Chapter 22, 10th Anniversary. In May, Queen Mary died after a fall from a horse. The news was almost as great a shock to Poland as to Hungary. The heart of the Polish people ached for the Queen. She was, to be sure, acquainted with grief. Death seemed to stand at her elbow, but this sorrow would in many ways be hardest to bear. Desolate indeed she appeared. Of the line of Charles Robert and Louis, she alone remained. Once again, Jadwiga carried her trouble to the Blessed Virgin, whose ear was never so weary that she could not hear. She spent hours on her knees before the tall crucifix in the royal chapel, and before the Madonna above the prie-dieu in her chamber. There was something intimately comforting in this picture of the Madonna. It had been brought to her from Florence some years ago, and ever since, the narrow space about it had havened her loved ones and had been her true home within the wide-spreading castle. She knew every fold of the Blessed Virgin's star-spangled blue robe and gauzy, pearl-edged headdress, every curve of the oval face with its compassionate eyes, of the speaking, compassionate hands. Scribe John had many times told her and her sister, as they watched him in his workshop at Buda, that hands could express as much as a face. Often, as she knelt, it seemed as if the Holy Mother's hand touched her head. When not in prayer, she found consolation in conversations with Bishop Peter. He was a tower of strength to her in these days. Fortunately, she had to give immediate attention to practical matters. She had at once to consider the question of whether or not she should claim the Hungarian crown, her legitimate heritage. This she determined to do. She resolutely took the title left by Queen Mary, though Jadwiga, while conceding her right to do so, was opposed to this attempt to unite the two thrones. He saw a weakening, not a strengthening of the Slav kingdom, as a result of an extension southward. However, he led an army for the Queen and her party beyond the Carpathians. On Hungarian soil, it was soon proved that the plan had not sufficient support to succeed, and after making certain temporary agreements, the Poles peacefully withdrew across the border. When later, Sigismund, who had been warring against the armies of the Sultan Bayezid, and had returned both beaten and robbed from the unlucky Battle of Nicopolis, hurried to Krakow to seek aid and assurance against the renewal of Jadwiga's attempt to claim the Arpad inheritance. He found, to his relief, a friendly reception. He sorely needed encouragement. His splendid army, half of it Hungarian, had been practically wiped out by the Turks. Southern Hungary, it seemed, would soon become a desert. In Dalmatia, too, troubles multiplied. Mary's death weakened the tie between the Hungarians and their restless king. He knew that if he lacked security in the north, anything might happen. So it was with renewed hope that he departed from the Wawel, carrying a treaty guaranteeing a 16-year peace between the neighbor countries. And this, despite the fact that not very long before, he had been negotiating with the Teutonic Order the division of Poland, a fact which Jadwiga was willing to overlook in his eagerness to prevent a rupture in those peaceful relationships in the West, which he conceived to be the only sure foundation for the structure he was building. Other important matters occupied the Queen's thought. Not from the beginning till the end of her life did she permit personal sorrow to interfere with state duties. Though she and the king had known less anxiety recently about Lithuania, they felt disquietude because of a flare-up in the Duke of Opeln's quarter. He had seized several provinces, necessitating Jadwiga sending envoys to eject him from them by force. However, his picturesque career was nearing its close. Already friends were deserting him. During half a century, he had been struggling for independent control of ever larger territories. Intrigues, pacts, dispatches had been his life. After his removal from the governorship of the Russian provinces for trying to hold the army in his own hands against the crown, he had received northern Dobrzen lands. But it had not been possible for him to remain there, or in fact in Poland. He was often in Hungary fomenting a scheme to divide Poland, an intrigue in which, as usual, the order was implicated. It was particularly painful to Jadwiga to see this old friend of her family a constant source of disorder and danger. It was to Opeln's protection that her mother had confided her, when she sent her, reluctantly and with misgiving, to Poland, and it was he who had boldly sponsored the happy meetings in the Franciscan refectory during William's visit in Krakow. With the power of this disturber of the peace waning, royal watchfulness could focus on Zamovit of Mazovia, whose ambition constituted an even stronger pull away from the centralization now underway. His marriage with Jagailo's sister Alexandra had helped to win a loyalty which the king, through a policy of concession, was endeavoring to hold. But whenever this involved the ceding of purely Polish territory, Jagailo encountered the determined opposition of both his wife and the dominant nobles, as he did in 95, when, after having planned to give Zamovit Radomsko, he was finally persuaded to withdraw that offer and to substitute for it Belz and several other cities. It was not surprising that Jagailo, a stranger, should fail to feel the same responsibility toward crown possessions that the grandniece of Casimir the Great and daughter of Louis the Great felt. From childhood, she had been taught the importance of holding them intact. When scarcely 15, she had not needed the king's advice to make her set forth at the head of an army to rescue the Ruthenian provinces. So far as Jagailo sought to give Poland more logical boundaries, she was in accord, but she was unalterably against alienation of land whose loss might curtail the extent and the strength of the kingdom. She valued the Polish-Lithuanian Union chiefly because of its religious significance and never thought of it as an obstacle to the performance of her first duty, that of preserving her inheritance from Casimir through her father, as he had left it to her. She and the controlling group of magnates were against giving Belz to Zamovit, as they had been against giving him Radomsko. But now they were not standing on equally sure ground, for though Belz had been won by Polish arms, a Lithuanian duke ruled it when Jagailo came to Poland. At this point, other troubles so engrossed the king that rather than risk more with Zamovit, he carried through his arrangement with his brother-in-law, in spite of Jadwiga's opposition. In 96, the nobles called a meeting in Krakow to consider Zamovit's demands and to arrive at some agreement as to how best to protect crown lands. Among other things, they decided that he should be given Volhynian territory, but Queen Jadwiga refused to confirm the grant until a year later. After she had done so, Zamovit's payment in gold was deposited in her treasury, instead of the king's, to make it appear that she had contracted the sale. The subterfuge precipitated further difficulties, which culminated in the paying back of the gold to Zamovit and the return of lands which, along with those retaken from the Duke of Opeln, were important in the rounding out of Poland's boundaries. After this clash, the king added to the queen's income, from the revenues of the salt mines of Bochnia and Wieliczka, 2,000 marks a year, that our dearest consort may be more comfortable and in better state. With each year's added experience, Jadwiga's confidence in her own judgment grew, and as she thus progressed, it was to be expected that king and queen would find increasing points of difference in their policies. They were often in opposition regarding their relations with the order and with Prince Vytautas, but it was over this question of crown lands that their divergence was perhaps widest. However, in a conflict of opinion, whether with the king or the magnates, the queen usually won. All honored her intelligence, her influence, which had made Skiergailo and Vytautas and their warring brothers trust their difficulties to her, was not waning, but increasing. With the dawn of 1396, the royal differences appeared suddenly less serious. This year marked the close of the first decade of the double reign. Throughout the land, with an intense feeling of satisfaction and gratitude, the people, taking stock, viewed the 10 years just closing against those of the nightmare of the interregnum. How beneficent, in comparison, had been this period which restored what the preceding one had destroyed. The Lithuanian had fulfilled to the letter his promises, and then thrown in something for fuller measure. he had demonstrated surprising qualities of statesmanship, of foresightedness. With what success this pagan of yesterday, this dreaded enemy of Poland, had assumed the responsibilities of a constitutional monarch. How clearly proved his capacity to assimilate Western conceptions as he pushed toward the goal of making the double kingdom an eminently European power in the service of civilization and Catholicism. The imaginative Slavs love a festival. Krakow threw itself into preparations for the anniversary with unbounded zest. Whole forests of pine and fir branches seemed to be bearing in upon the capital, as, with jingling of bells and calling of fur-capped drivers, the laden sleds raced in and out the gates. City flags, the 3 square towers of St. Stanislaus and Wenceslaus, and the nation's white eagle, floated above the January snow. Rugs and tapestries hung from the windows of the burgher palaces flanking the marketplace. St. Mary's Cathedral and other churches and outdoor shrines were ablaze with candles. Men and women in fur coats, some of rough goat or sheep, some of wolf or astrakhan, poured into the city from all quarters of the kingdom. There was gay rivalry over the splendor of the painted sleds, the lines of the high-stepping horses, and the beauty of flying ribbons and tree boughs. Many of the men who had gone 10 years before to meet the Lithuanian led in the celebrating. Dobislav, former Castellan of Wawel Castle, and Archbishop Bodzanta of Gniezno, who had baptized and crowned him, were dead. But Yasko, Dmitri of Gore, Peter Kmita, Spitko, Sedjivoy, and many other tried friends were present. Faithful Peter Viz, wearing the mitre and carrying the crozier of the bishopric of Krakow, extended his hand in blessing as he conducted successive services. The guilds had vied with one another in preparing commemorative pageants and merrymaking. And for days the teeming city, peasants and nobles, grown-ups and children, danced and sang and ate and gave thanks together. Jadwiga, with characteristic generosity, tried to turn the full tribute of the occasion to Jogailo, whose arrival in Poland it commemorated. But how could she? Whose, after all, asked the people, was the real power and whose the delegated? Above all gratitude to the Lithuanian, rose reverent gratitude to herself, their wonderful, valiant queen, hiding her sorrows, effacing herself. Yet shadow fell across the scene. Though in their love and adoration of Jadwiga, many tried on this day to suppress the dark question in their minds. To what future could the new empire look so long as this royal pair remained childless? Others, less sensitive, pressed their questioning. Must there not, after all, exist some secret sin which heaven was thus punishing? However, these were days chiefly of rejoicing, not of questioning. No previous event had so clearly revealed the power of the double throne. A number of civil and military officials eager to join in the anniversary festival were held in Lithuania, which Vytautas had once again involved with the order, this time through negotiations over the Dobrzen lands. Even yet he did not realize, as he would later, that he would reach his objective, independent control of Lithuania, not through these temporary alliances with his country's worst enemy, but by further agreements with his cousin, and a complete break with their common foe. In little more than a decade, the world was to be thrilled again, as it had been when it watched his and Jogailo's father working together. In the Battle of Tannenberg, with the cry, Krakow and Vilnius, together these sons were to drive the White Capes at last to utter defeat. In Vytautas, tendencies represented by his father and uncle met, for while standing, as Kęstutis did, for the revival of Lithuanian nationality, he looked, as Algirdas had, toward union with Russia. Following Algirdas's path of diplomacy, he had married his daughter Sophia to Vasily, Grand Duke of Muscovy, and pictured himself as destined to liberate that country from the Tatars. Had Jogailo's father, who drove the horde of Kipchak over the steppes to the Crimea, not been simultaneously engaged with the order, Lithuania, and not Muscovy, might have become the dominant power of Eastern Europe. Vytautas believed that he could yet make it that, and already his ear caught the honeyed title, Emperor of the North and the East. God prepares me to rule over all lands, he once said. Jadwiga was not blinded by his grandiose schemes, by his chimerical hopes, and listened with anxiety to his increasing demands for money and supplies, for weapons and horses and harness and experienced leaders. She saw Poland impoverished for ends impossible of attainment, ends which, even could they be achieved, would, through Oriental influences, inevitably weaken Slavic civilization. Jogailo lent a more ready ear and hand, yet he kept his balance and warned and restrained his cousin at many points, encouraging him whenever he thought Vytautas' enterprise would fortify the position of the United Kingdom in Europe. In this anniversary year, those who foresaw only defeat for Vytautas in the East were obliged to admit his temporary success, for he returned from a victorious campaign with a great number of Tatar prisoners, some of whom he settled in Poland, and others in a colony near Vilnius. But Jadwiga still saw the Lithuanian wars bringing not benefit, but loss to Poland. The warfare with which the Lithuanian army could chiefly aid the United Kingdom was that against the order, and except for defense, she was opposed to fighting the Teutonic Knights. So, while continuing her works of peace for both Lithuania and Poland, she consistently refused unlimited grants of war supplies to Vytautas. In 1397, she founded a college for Lithuanians in Prague University, something she had long wished to accomplish. She had finally succeeded in buying one of the most beautiful buildings in the Bohemian capital for her purpose. This was a large house near the palace of King Wenceslaus, which fortunately escaped destruction the following year, when so many other buildings were demolished during the religious riots induced by the teachings of Jan Hus. The school was called the College of Queen Jadwiga. In this year, too, Pope Boniface made her happy by granting a request. Poland had many times asked the privilege of including the faculty of theology in its university to be. Now Boniface sanctioned the plan. Every year registered additions to Krakow's university site. And more Jadwiga was interesting her closest friends among the women of her court in her cherished undertaking. In this university group were Constance of Konik-Polska, wife of the governor of Sieradz, Jogailo's sister, Duchess Alexandra of Mazovia, the old widow of Otto Pilecki, and Catherine Mezikawa of Dobrova, wife of the governor of Lvov. There was many a round-table discussion, when these intelligent, patriotic women gathered about their queen to consider the merits of the Paris University type of organization as contrasted with that of Padua or Bologna. Far-seeing Casimir, who more than 30 years earlier had begun university buildings in the village named after him, outside the city walls, but had not finished them, had followed Bologna. His effort had failed. Jadwiga wished to follow Paris, and, since she could count on the Pope's ever-growing support of her projects, she hoped to include a school of theology with those of law and medicine and philosophy. She planned that handsome buildings in St. Anne Street should serve as living quarters for the faculty. She and her aides talked of teachers to be found, of the number of students to be admitted, of a multitude of things, but oftenest of the library, for the library, Jadwiga believed, was to the university as the spring to the stream.